Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Amanda Zangrillo, and I serve the role of the Director of the Autism Diagnostic Clinics and Interim Director of the Severe Behavior Program here at the Munroe-Meyer Institute. I'm pleased to be able to lead a discussion today on understanding behavior and why we do the things that we do. Let's get started. In this discussion, we'll discuss what behavior is and why we do what we do, but also what problematic behavior looks like and ultimately why it should raise red flags when it does. And then we'll also talk about when and how to get help. To start us on our journey, we're actually going to start with understanding behavior. Now, this might seem like a fairly complex issue, as there are parts of our field that are dedicated solely to understanding behavior. But to break it down simply, behavior is anything that we do, think, or feel. And for our purposes today, we'll really focus on things that we can actually see with our own eyes and that we potentially could even record on our own. Now, as young infants and even as young children, we start to learn to behave in different ways. Oftentimes, we really think of this as communication, and I really encourage everyone to think about the things that we do as communicating wants and needs. Again, as very young children, we start to develop our own communication behaviors and our own types of behaviors. And that might include things like waving, shaking our heads yes and no, even signing more or please. Those behaviors all serve communication purposes. We also start to develop more complex language, like single words like mama, dada, more. And then we also start to string those together into more complex sentences or phrases. There's also situations where those appropriate behaviors or communication behaviors might break down. And those are the situations where we start to see other behaviors emerge, like problematic behaviors. Even though we start to think about things like tantrums or crying or even hitting yourself as problematic behaviors, at the root of it all, there's still communication. Our children are telling us that they want something or that they need something. To break it down, we're going to start to look at what happens before we behave to help set the stage to understand what's motivating those behaviors. There are four very common and very key situations that tend to motivate behavior. First, we often think about situations where somebody wants something that they can't have or that they don't have. And these might be things like tangible items or food or specific activities. We also see situations where somebody might want attention, or situations where somebody might have something presented that they don't like, and therefore they get quite motivated to make that thing stop or go away or to escape it. We also have situations that are kind of more internal, where we have stimulation that happens that is either too much or maybe even too little, which then sets the stage for getting rid of that overstimulation or getting more stimulation depending on what's going on. So those are really four of the key reasons that we may be motivated to behave in a certain way. It's also very important to understand what happens after behavior, as this can also tell us more about whether we might strengthen behavior or even weaken behavior. The things that influence behavior on the tail end can also fit into some distinct categories. And as you might guess, they're very similar to the things that motivate behavior, such as getting the thing that we want, getting the attention that we wanted, getting that thing we didn't like to go away or stop, as well as getting some sort of balance for those internal or stimulation behaviors as well. Now let's look at this together so that we can help simplify and kind of problem solve some of the common things that we see each day. Let's start with a common scenario of what happens before behavior, as well as what happens after behavior. One thing that's so important to understand is that when these two things match, what happens before behavior corresponds with what happens after, we can actually strengthen behavior. So let's take the example of the little guy who was trying to get at some of that delicious fruit sitting up on the counter. This scenario really set the stage for motivation to behave in a way to get access to those foods. Now, there's a lot of different things that we could do to communicate to somebody that you want that fruit. You might say, fruit, please, or more, but you also might see a tantrum in front of the kitchen sink. All of those things are really saying to the parent who's standing idly by, hey, I want that fruit. What happens after the behavior, though, is quite important. So in this case, if what follows the behavior matches that motivator, we see that these things work together to actually strengthen behavior, which is so important. So if my child is appropriately asking more fruit, please, and I give more fruit, that's great because I'm increasing the likelihood that they're going to try that in the future. However, how this could work against me is if my toddler drops to the floor and has a tantrum until I give more fruit, and I actually give that piece of fruit, that actually will strengthen that behavior as well. So what now they're learning in that scenario is that dropping to the floor also is a way to communicate getting access to that fruit. So your reaction or your consequence, what happens after that behavior, is quite important. Let's take a look at another scenario. This one is a little bit tricky. So again, we have those situations where we have the fruit that's up on the counter where they want that delicious fruit. But this time, the child drops to the floor and has a tantrum in front of the sink. So our behavior is a tantrum behavior. So again, what happens after that behavior is very, very important because this time, if I don't provide the fruit, I actually teach my child that that behavior does not work anymore to access what they want. So there's a lot of learning happening here for our young toddler who wants that fruit. So again, what happens before, during, and after is quite critical for helping to learn what behaviors we want to see. Next, let's go through another scenario. In this situation, let's say we have our nighttime bedtime routine playing out, and I tell my toddler it's time to brush their teeth. For some children, this might be a quite fun activity, but in most cases, or in my household at least, this is not fun. So we have now a situation happening before behavior where the child is likely to want to escape or get out of that situation. So that's really going to set the stage for the behaviors that I'm likely to see. Take a minute and think about your own household. What kind of behaviors might you see or might your child display to tell you that they want to get out of doing an activity? And that might be brushing teeth, it might be the nighttime routine, it might be brushing your hair. If you thought of tantrum behaviors, that's quite similar to what happens at my house. However, other children might engage in other behaviors like saying no, thank you, please, or even just doing the toothbrushing routine. All of those behaviors, again, are communicating, I want to get this done with or over with or to go away. But what, again, is so critical is looking at not only what happens before the behavior, but then also what happens after the behavior. In those situations where I find something extremely unpleasant and I want it to go away, and I engage in a behavior to tell you that I don't want to do it, and then it's followed by escape, again, we're actually strengthening behavior because those two things match, right? The child's getting exactly what they want. If we go back to that same scenario and we have a situation where, again, I present my toddler with a toothbrushing activity that they don't want to do and they find extremely distasteful, and then they drop to the floor in tantrum. If I don't give in and allow escape, I actually now have a situation where the beginning activity, what's happening before, that motivation to escape, and what happens after following through don't match. And so in this case, I'm actually not strengthening the tantrum, but rather teaching my toddler that tantrums don't get what you want. So in this situation, we have a very nice sequence of events that allows us to understand maybe what's motivating the behavior, but then also how we can really control whether we strengthen or weaken that same behavior. So now that we've talked through the sequence of events that can really set the stage for increasing or decreasing behaviors, now let's take a look at some of those different situations that can be problematic. As we discussed before, problematic behaviors have a likelihood to occur once we start to put those very specific motivation situations in place. For most individuals, and if we really look at maybe a typical 2-year-old, the things that are on this list are actually quite common. So it's developmentally appropriate to see things like tantrums, non-compliance, or saying no, or not wanting to do what you are asked to do. Small aggressions like hitting or kicking or swatting at someone when they're trying to follow through. Self-injurious behaviors are also quite common. And in very young children, we oftentimes will see some head hitting or head banging, particularly when upset. We also might see behaviors like property destruction or even dangerous behavior like climbing or running off. However, there becomes a point where behaviors may become too intense, or they might even become too frequent, or as a child ages, that the force with which they engage in some of these behaviors becomes particularly problematic. And in these scenarios, we really look for situations where these behaviors may impede being able to do daily activities. So maybe as mom, I no longer go to the grocery store with my children anymore because the tantrums are too intense that I can't go about my daily activities. Or when I present that toothbrush, my child starts to hit themselves in the face or in the head. And those self injurious behaviors now produce redness or swelling to the point where it's unsafe to try to proceed with toothbrushing. Therefore, I avoid it altogether. There are very specific situations where these types of behaviors can either cause tissue damage or really can impede daily life. And in those scenarios, we really encourage families to start to reach out and to understand how to access help. That brings us to our last and final point of kind of developing that pathway for accessing supports and intervention. Now, first and foremost, we kind of turn our discussion to who can help and who those first line of defense workers are for our families. First and foremost, we really recommend that a lot of families connect with their pediatrician or family physician. This is the most constant contact that we have from a very early age, when our children are born, all the way through school age. And those pediatricians or family physicians are a good first step for having discussions about what behaviors are occurring that are problematic, and then also learning about what is typical for that child's age and developmental level. Another avenue may be discussing with your school care providers as well as your daycare providers if problem behaviors are increasing in the home setting, but also if those behaviors are increasing in the school setting. Sometimes we see that behaviors increase in both settings, and so it's really important to keep that seamless line of communication. Whether it's your family physician or your school or daycare provider, or maybe even both, oftentimes the next step is to access a referral to a specialized behavioral provider. Two avenues for assessing those referrals or accessing those referrals include discussions with a behavioral psychologist or even a board certified behavior analyst, sometimes also called a BCBA. Both these individuals are skilled at understanding not only child behavior, but also understanding the conditions that surround why we do what we do. And oftentimes, these individuals can be very helpful in coaching parents to empower them in understanding their child's behavior and adding some tools to the tool belt to help manage these behaviors in the home, community, or school setting. To recap, as we discussed today, there are many situations that really occasion or set the stage for why we do the things we do, as well as could potentially strengthen behaviors that we do. This might include getting attention, getting access to items or tangibles or even toys or food, getting a break, escape, or avoiding something that we don't like, as well as getting sensory feedback or minimizing sensory feedback from the environment. Understanding these variables can really help us understand what's triggering problem behavior, but then also help us understand whether we might be strengthening or weakening those behaviors. It's also really critical to understand how and when to get help. So, as a reminder, accessing supports through your family pediatrician or family provider is really important, as well as connecting closely with your school. These referrals to behavioral pediatricians, behavioral psychologists, board certified behavior analysts can be a really critical next step. Thank you for your time, and we hope that you enjoyed your care presentation.